Victoria Knight had been in control of billion-dollar deals, legal battles, and high-stakes negotiations. But nothing had ever rattled him like the sight of her Daphne Hayes, his assistant, standing in his office doorway, adjusting the strap of her watch, completely unaware that she was the one thing in his life he couldn't afford to lose. "Your schedule is packed today," she said, flipping through her tablet. "Board meeting at 10, investor luncheon at noon, and then—" "Cancel the luncheon," his voice came out sharper than intended. Daphne blinked at him. "That's with Sinclair Investments. You've been chasing that deal for months." Victoria dragged a hand through his dark hair, exhaling slowly. "Then move it. I'll meet them another time." Daphne studied him, her deep brown eyes narrowing slightly. She always knew when something was off with him, not just as an assistant, but as someone who had worked beside him for 5 years, building his empire with unshakable loyalty. She was the only person in his life who had never let him down. And that was exactly why he couldn't let himself want her. "All right," she said finally, tapping on the screen. "I'll reschedule it." He nodded curtly, forcing his attention back to the reports on his desk. But the second she walked away, the scent of her perfume lingered, a cruel reminder of the feelings he had spent years burying. Victoria Knight was not a man who made reckless decisions. He had built his billion-dollar empire with calculation and control. But Daphne made him reckless. She made him crave things he had no business wanting, like the way she laughed when she thought no one was listening, or how she always knew exactly what he needed before he even asked. And worst of all, she made him think about what it would be like if she were his, not just in his office, but in his life. But if he crossed that line, he risked losing everything. That evening, Daphne knocked once before stepping into his office. "Your car's waiting downstairs." He leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment. She had pulled her dark curls into a low bun, her sharp navy dress perfectly professional. But she was more than just polished efficiency. She was warmth, intelligence, and the one person he trusted completely. "I'm not leaving yet," he said. She sighed, setting her tablet down. "Victoria, you've been here since 6 this morning." He smirked and she said, folding her arms, "You're running on caffeine and stubbornness. Go home." The corner of his mouth twitched. "You're bossy. You pay me to be." He shouldn't have laughed, but he did. This was why Daphne was different. She didn't treat him like a billionaire or a CEO, she treated him like a person. And that terrified him. She hesitated, shifting on her heels before speaking again. "Actually, there's something I wanted to ask you." His expression sobered. "Go on." "My friend's engagement party is this Saturday," she said, a little too quickly, "and I might have implied I was bringing someone." His chest tightened. "Are you asking me to go with you?" She waved a hand. "Not as a date, just as my boss. So I don't have to deal with the endless questions about why I'm always working and never dating." Victoria exhaled, but the relief he expected never came. Instead, something darker twisted inside him. She didn't think of him that way. Of course she didn't. He was her boss. And yet, the thought of her with someone else laughing, smiling, letting another man be the one who got to know all the little things about her made his jaw tighten. "I'll go," he said before he could stop himself. Her eyes lit up. "Really?" He nodded once. "But if I'm going, I'm doing it right." She frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said smoothly, standing and adjusting his cuffs, "I'm not showing up as your boss, I'm showing up as the man no one questions." Her brow furrowed. "And who is that?" He stepped closer, just enough to watch the way her breath caught. "Your date." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't move away. For a moment, the air between them changed thick, electric, like a storm waiting to break. But then she cleared her throat. "All right, Mr. Knight, just don't scare away my friends." He chuckled, though his pulse was anything but steady. He was already scaring himself. Because this wasn't just a game. This was a line he had no business crossing. And yet, for the first time in his life, Victoria Knight wasn't sure he wanted to play it safe. Victoria Knight didn't do things halfway. If he was going to be Daphne's date for the evening, then he was going to ensure no one questioned it. Which was why on Saturday evening, a sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment building, and Victoria stepped out, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him like a second skin. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt as his gaze traveled up the brick facade of her building. It was modest, nothing like the penthouses and estates he was used to, but it suited her practical, efficient, no-nonsense. The driver opened the door for him, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, tangled in thoughts he had no business entertaining. He took a steadying breath before heading inside. When Daphne opened the door, he almost forgot how to speak. She wasn't in her usual sharp office attire. Instead, she wore a deep emerald dress that hugged her curves in a way that made his pulse stutter for half a second, a detail he refused to acknowledge. The fabric shimmered slightly under the light, and her hair, usually pulled back, cascaded in soft waves over her shoulders. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she lifted a brow. "You're staring." Victoria's throat worked, but his voice remained even. "I wasn't expecting this." She grabbed her small clutch from the table. "What were you expecting?" He dragged his gaze back up to her face, forcing himself to focus. "Something safe." Daphne laughed, shaking her head as she stepped past him, her perfume lingering in the air between them. "You should know by now I don't do safe." Victoria followed her to the car, biting back a response that would have betrayed too much. Instead, he opened the door for her, watching as she slid inside before joining her. The air in the enclosed space felt different, charged, tense. Halfway to the venue, she shifted slightly, her fingers tracing the edge of her clutch. "So how exactly are you planning to sell this?" He glanced at her. "Sell what?" "This," she said, motioning between them. "You're supposed to be my date. What's the plan?" Victoria leaned back, considering her for a moment. "I don't need a plan." She scoffed. "Of course you do, you plan everything." He let a slow exhale escape. "Then trust me." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't argue. That was the problem, wasn't it? She trusted him, always had. And he wasn't sure he deserved it. The engagement party was held in a grand ballroom, the kind dripping in crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Victoria had been to 1,000 of these events, but none had ever felt quite like this. Because tonight he wasn't here as the CEO of Knight Enterprises. He was here as Daphne's date. The moment they stepped inside, eyes turned their way. He felt the shift in the room, the subtle glances, the quiet whispers. He had that effect. It came with the territory, but tonight it wasn't just about him. It was about Daphne. She lifted her chin, her posture straightening with practiced ease. She was used to navigating high-pressure environments, but this was different. This was personal. A woman in a sleek silver gown approached, her eyes widening slightly when she saw Victoria. "Daphne," she said with a knowing smile. "And wow, you weren't joking when you said you were bringing someone." Daphne's laughter was light, but Victoria didn't miss the slight tension in her shoulders. "Victoria, this is Claire, my best friend." Claire's gaze flickered between them, assessing. "Nice to meet you," she said, extending a hand. Victoria shook it, his grip firm. "Likewise." Claire's smile deepened. "You do realize every single person in this room is going to be talking about this, right?" Daphne sighed. "That's not necessary." Claire ignored her, turning back to Victoria. "So how long have you two been?" She trailed off, letting the question hang in the air. Victoria didn't hesitate. "A while." Daphne shot him a look, but he didn't blink. He wasn't going to let anyone doubt it. Claire's eyes gleamed. "Interesting." Before Daphne could protest, another voice cut in. "Daphne, there you are." A man approached, his expression warm but laced with something else, something possessive. Victoria recognized it immediately. This was a man who wanted Daphne. And Victoria hated him instantly. The man stopped in front of them, barely sparing Victoria a glance before focusing on her. "I was hoping we'd have a chance to catch up." Daphne's expression remained polite. "Ethan, this is Victoria Knight." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. "The Victoria Knight." Victoria leveled him with a measured gaze. That depends on which one you're referring to. Ethan forced a chuckle, the one who's all over the financial news. Victoria didn't respond, he didn't need to. Ethan turned back to Daphne, so this is new. Victoria slipped a hand to the small of Daphne's back, his touch light but unmistakable. Not that new. Daphne stiffened slightly, but she didn't move away. Ethan's expression darkened, but he recovered quickly. Well, I suppose I'll have to get used to seeing you around then. Victoria didn't break eye contact. Yes, you will. Ethan lingered a second longer before finally excusing himself. The moment he was out of earshot, Daphne exhaled. What was that? Victoria's hand remained where it was. That was what you wanted, wasn't it? She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. I wanted a date, not a territorial display. His fingers flexed slightly against her back before he pulled away. Consider it both. Daphne shook her head, but there was something in her eyes, something he couldn't quite decipher. He didn't know what was worse, the fact that he had done it so effortlessly or the fact that he had wanted to. Because the truth was, it hadn't been an act. Not for him. Victoria Knight was not accustomed to losing control. Yet, standing in the middle of the engagement party with his hand still tingling from where it had rested on Daphne's back, he felt dangerously close to the edge. He had meant to play the role of her date with precision, just enough to silence the speculation, to make sure no one questioned why she wasn't seeing anyone. But seeing Ethan approach her, watching the way the man had looked at her like she was something to claim, had ignited something primal in him. And worse, he had acted on it. Daphne had let it slide in the moment, but now, as they moved through the glittering ballroom, he could feel the weight of her silence beside him. She wasn't the type to let things go unnoticed. A waiter passed, offering champagne, and Victoria took a glass, more for something to do than anything else. Across the room, Daphne excused herself to speak with an older couple, leaving him momentarily alone. Claire appeared at his side, watching him with an expression that was far too knowing. You know, she mused, tilting her head. When Daphne said she was bringing a date, I assumed it was some poor guy she had roped into it at the last minute. Victoria took a slow sip of his drink before meeting her gaze. Disappointed. Claire laughed, shaking her head. More like curious. You don't strike me as the kind of man who does fake dates. He glanced toward Daphne, who was deep in conversation, her laughter lighting up the space around her. I don't. Claire hummed, considering him. Then why are you here? The directness of her question caught him off guard. He had spent years mastering the art of deflection, yet something about Daphne's best friend made it difficult to sidestep. She asked, he said simply. Claire raised an eyebrow, and you always do what she asks. Victoria exhaled through his nose, setting his glass down on the nearest table. Daphne is the most competent person in my life. If she needs something, I make sure she has it. Claire studied him, then glanced at Daphne across the room. You know, she talks about you all the time. That caught his attention, does she? Of course, you're practically her whole life, Claire said, watching him carefully. She won't admit it, but she revolves around you. Your schedule dictates hers, your priorities become hers. And yet, I've never seen her look at you the way she should. Victoria's jaw tightened, and how is that? Claire smiled, like a woman who knows she's wanted. For a moment, the noise of the party faded. The weight of those words settled deep in his chest, pressing against something he had spent years locking away. Daphne didn't know she couldn't. Because if she did, everything they had built, the partnership, the trust, the seamless way they worked together would crumble. And he would rather suffer in silence than risk losing her entirely. Before he could formulate a response, Daphne returned, her eyes flickering between them. Should I be concerned about whatever conversation I just walked into? Claire grinned, just getting to know your dates. Daphne shot her a look but didn't press further. Instead, she turned toward Victoria. I think we've done enough socializing, ready to leave. He nodded, more than eager for a reprieve from the carefully controlled chaos of the evening. As they stepped outside, the night air was crisp, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. The car was already waiting, and Victoria opened the door for her, watching as she slid inside. The drive back was quiet at first, the tension from earlier still lingering between them. Finally, Daphne exhaled, "You didn't have to do all that." He glanced at her, "All what?" The possessive act with Ethan, the whole not that new comment, she shook her head. "I just needed someone to stand next to me, not stake a claim." Victoria's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "You didn't seem to mind at the time." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Because I didn't want to make a scene, but we both know that wasn't just for show." He kept his gaze forward. "You're imagining things." Daphne let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sure, because the Victoria Knight I know always makes impulsive emotional decisions." He didn't respond. Because the truth was, she was right. She sighed, leaning her head back against the seat. "Look, I appreciate you coming tonight. I do, but whatever that was, it can't happen again." His chest tightened. "Why not?" She turned to him, her voice softer now. "Because we work, you and me as we work, and I can't afford to lose that." His fingers flexed against the leather. "Neither can I." For a moment, they just looked at each other, the weight of unspoken things pressing between them. Then she nodded, turning away. "Good." The rest of the ride was silent. When they arrived at her apartment, he stepped out to open her door, but she hesitated before getting out. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for tonight." His throat worked, but he just nodded. She lingered a moment longer before finally stepping out and heading inside. Victoria watched her go, something heavy settling in his chest. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if doing the right thing was the same as doing what he wanted. Victoria Knight had spent his entire career mastering control over his business, his reputation, and most importantly, his emotions. But as he sat in his office the following evening, staring at the untouched reports in front of him, he realized control meant nothing when it came to Daphne Hayes. She was everywhere. In his thoughts, in the air he breathed, in the ache that settled deep in his chest every time he remembered the way she had looked at him in the car, the quiet finality in her voice, when she told him that whatever that was couldn't happen again. He had agreed, he had nodded like it didn't matter, like he wasn't unraveling from the inside out. But it did matter. And the longer he sat here, pretending it didn't, the more unbearable it became. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts, and before he could respond, Daphne stepped inside. Her presence was so familiar, so natural, that it took him a second to remember that things weren't the same between them anymore. She set a file down on his desk, her expression carefully composed. "The finalized contracts from Sinclair Investments, they're ready for your signature." He didn't move to pick them up. Instead, he studied her, looking for any sign that she felt even a fraction of what he did. But she was unreadable, her usual efficiency masking whatever emotions might have been beneath the surface. "Anything else?" she asked after a beat, her tone professional. That was it then. She was going to pretend, act like nothing had changed. And maybe that was the right choice. Maybe letting this go was the only way to preserve what they had built. But then she turned to leave, and before he could stop himself, he spoke. "Daphne." She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the folder she was holding, but she didn't turn around. He should let her go. He should swallow whatever reckless thing was about to leave his mouth and move on. But he couldn't. "You asked me why I acted the way I did at the party," he said, his voice quieter now. "You wanted to know if it was for show." Her shoulders tensed, but she still didn't face him. "It wasn't." For a long moment the room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. Then slowly she set the folder down and turned. "Victoria." "I know," he said, cutting her off before she could remind him of all the reasons this was a bad idea. "I know what you're going to say, that we work as we are, that we shouldn't risk ruining it." Her lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. He stood rounding the desk until he was only a few feet from her. but I can't pretend anymore. Her breath hitched, and for the first time since that night, he saw something crack in her expression. Something uncertain, something vulnerable. I tried, he admitted, his voice lower now, rougher. Tried to ignore it, to convince myself that what I felt didn't matter, that as long as you were here beside me I could live with it. He exhaled sharply. But I was wrong. Daphne swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. Victoria, this is. Tell me you don't feel it, he interrupted, stepping closer. Tell me that when I put my hand on your back, when I looked at you across that room, you felt nothing. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes darting away. That's what I thought, he murmured. She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not that simple. There is, he countered. You're the one making it complicated. She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Because it is complicated, Victoria. You are my entire career, my stability, my everything. If this goes wrong, I lose more than just a job, I lose you. He reached for her then, his fingers brushing against hers before she could pull away. You won't lose me. She looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw the fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of what this could mean, what it could destroy. I don't want to ruin us, she admitted, her voice raw. His grip on her tightened, his thumb grazing over her knuckles. Then don't run from it. Her eyes searched his, and for a long moment he thought she might pull away, that she might walk out of this office and never look back. But then slowly she exhaled and took a step closer. And just like that, the last thread of control he had snapped. He reached for her, cupping her face between his hands, his thumb brushing over the soft curve of her cheek. Tell me to stop, he murmured, giving her one last chance. Oh, she didn't. Instead, she closed the distance between them, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt. And then she kissed him. It wasn't tentative or hesitant, it was years of restraint breaking all at once. It was every unsaid word, every stolen glance, every moment they had spent pretending they weren't standing on the edge of something inevitable. Victoria deepened the kiss, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her against him like he was afraid she would disappear if he let go. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling, he rested his forehead against hers. No more pretending, he murmured. Daphne let out a soft, shaky laugh. No more pretending. And for the first time in years, Victoria Knight felt completely, utterly free. Victoria Knight was not a man who second-guessed his decisions. Yet, as he stood in the dim glow of his penthouse, staring out over the city skyline, his thoughts were tangled in knots he couldn't undo. Daphne was still in his arms, her head resting against his chest, her fingers idly tracing patterns against the fabric of his shirt. The warmth of her body against his was something he had already memorized, something he knew he wouldn't be able to forget. He had kissed her, she had kissed him back, and now everything was different. She exhaled, her breath warm against his neck. We just blew up everything, didn't we? His fingers curled slightly against the small of her back, only if we let it. She pulled back just enough to look at him, the city lights reflected in her deep brown eyes, making them impossibly more captivating. You say that like it's easy. It's not, he admitted, his voice steady, but nothing about us ever has been. Her expression softened, and for the first time he saw something shift in her gaze, acceptance, maybe even relief. But beneath it there was still uncertainty. She stepped away, wrapping her arms around herself. The absence of her against him felt immediate, almost jarring. So, what now? Do we just pretend like this was inevitable? Victoria leaned against the edge of his desk, watching her carefully. Wasn't it? Daphne let out a quiet, almost breathless laugh. You act like we didn't fight this for years. He tilted his head slightly, and where did that get us? Her lips parted, but she didn't have an answer. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was filled with all the things they had never said, all the moments they had ignored. Then finally she spoke again. I don't want to lose what we have. His jaw tightened. You won't. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. How do you know that? What happens if this doesn't work? He pushed off the desk, closing the space between them again. Then I'll fix it. Daphne searched his face as if looking for any sign of doubt. You can't guarantee that. His fingers brushed lightly against her chin, tilting her face up toward his. I don't make promises I can't keep. Her breath caught, but she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything settling into place. Then finally she nodded, okay. A slow, quiet exhale left him, okay. She lifted her chin, but if we do this, we do it right, no secrets, no pretending. Victoria's lips curved slightly, agreed. Daphne hesitated for only a second before reaching for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. Then let's see where this goes. The words settled deep inside him, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. And for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he had to lose. He was thinking about everything he had to gain. The following weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions, each one threading Victoria and Daphne closer together in ways neither of them could have anticipated. What had once been a carefully drawn line between professional and personal had dissolved, leaving them in uncharted territory where every touch, every glance, carried a weight they could no longer ignore. Victoria had always prided himself on control, on maintaining order in every facet of his life. But with Daphne, there was no controlling the way she had embedded herself into him. She was in his office, in his home, in his thoughts long after she had left, and he didn't want it any other way. But while their relationship had shifted, the world around them remained the same, demanding, relentless, always watching. One evening, as Victoria wrapped up a meeting, Daphne entered his office, her expression unreadable. He immediately set aside the document he had been reviewing, his focus narrowing entirely on her. She hesitated for only a second before speaking. There's something you need to see. She handed him her tablet, and as his eyes scanned the screen, his jaw tightened. A leaked articles. The headline was bold, impossible to ignore. Victoria Knight's secret romance, did the billionaire CEO fall for his assistant? Accompanying it was a photo from the engagement party, one where he had stood too close to Daphne, his hand resting lightly on her back, his gaze unmistakably locked onto her. Victoria exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. Who leaked this? Daphne folded her arms, her lips pressing together. No one in the company would dare, but someone at the party must have taken the photo. He set the tablet down, his fingers drumming once against the desk before stilling. This changes nothing. She let out a quiet breath. It changes everything, Victoria. People will talk, they'll speculate, and when they do, they'll say, only got this job because. His gaze sharpened. Because what? She hesitated. Because we're together. Anger flickered in his chest, not at her, but at the idea that anyone would dare question her competence. Daphne had built her place beside him through sheer skill and determination. The idea that anyone would reduce her to a mere accessory to his success was infuriating. He pushed back from his desk and stood, closing the space between them in an instant. Let them talk. Her expression wavered, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. And if it affects your business? His voice was steady. I built this company from nothing. No gossip column or speculative article is going to change that. She looked up at him, searching his face for something. And if it affects me? His hand lifted, fingers grazing her cheek, his touch achingly gentle. Then we deal with it together. Daphne exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. You make it sound so simple. It is, he said, unwavering, because I won't let anything touch you. She let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. You can't control everything, Victoria. He tilted his head, his lips curving slightly. Watch me. And he did. Within hours, his legal team had shut down further speculation, ensuring any future leaks would come with consequences. He made it clear to the board, to the media, to anyone who dared question it, Daphne Hayes was not just his assistant, not just some woman caught in the orbit of his success. She was his equal, his partner in every way that mattered. And when the storm passed, when the noise faded into the background, she was still there. which was when he realized he didn't just want to protect her. He wanted to keep her. Forever. One evening, as they stood on his penthouse balcony overlooking the city, he reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against the small velvet box he had carried for days now. Daphne leaned against the railing, the soft breeze teasing strands of her hair loose. "You're quiet tonight." Victoria stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing a kiss to the curve of her shoulder. "I've been thinking." She hummed, "That sounds dangerous." He chuckled against her skin before turning her to face him. "About us." Her expression softened. "What about us?" He took a steady breath, then dropped to one knee. Daphne's breath caught, her hands flying to her mouth. Victoria held her gaze, his voice quieter now but no less certain. "I never thought I would need anyone. I built a life where I answered to no one, where everything I had was because I fought for it. And then you walked in and suddenly nothing made sense without you." Her eyes glistened, her lips parting. "I don't just love you, Daphne, I need you. I need your stubbornness, your brilliance, your ability to put me in my place when no one else dares." He exhaled, his grip on the ring box tightening. "So, I'm asking you not as your boss, not as the man who should have stayed away, but as the man who can't imagine a future without you." He flipped the box open, revealing the ring, a stunning, timeless piece that reflected the city lights. "Marry me." Daphne let out a shaky laugh, half a sob, before nodding fervently. "Yes." The second the word left her lips, he rose, capturing her mouth with his, sealing a promise neither of them would ever break. Months later, they stood before a small gathering of close friends and family, exchanging vows that had been written in every moment they had ever shared. Victoria slid the ring onto her finger, his grip firm, steady. "You're mine," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Daphne's lips curved, her eyes shining. "Always." And as he kissed his wife Victoria Knight knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was the only deal he had ever made that truly mattered. A lifetime with her. And nothing had ever felt more right.